Just after midnight on April 16, 2026, the first wave of Ukrainian long-range drones crosses the Black Sea coastline near Tuapse, a port city in Russia's Krasnodar region that most of the world had never had a reason to learn the name of. Ahead of them sits the Tuapse refinery, a Rosneft-owned facility processing roughly 12 million metric tons of crude oil a year, and the export terminal beside it feeding tankers that carry Russian naphtha, fuel oil, and diesel out into the wider world. By the time the sun comes up over the Black Sea that morning, this port will be burning, and it's going to keep burning, on and off, for the next 6 weeks. Let's set the stage here, because Tuapse isn't a random target that got unlucky. This is one of the load-bearing pillars of Russia's Black Sea oil export network, sitting roughly 300 miles from the nearest active front line, far enough back that for most of this war, Russian planners treated it the way they treated a lot of deep interior infrastructure, as functionally safe. That assumption has been eroding for months as Ukraine's long-range strike program matures, and on this particular night, it collapses completely. This wasn't a single lucky drone slipping through a gap in the defenses. Over the following 6 weeks, this port gets hit again and again and again, in a sustained campaign that turns one of Russia's key energy export hubs into a genuine ongoing disaster, industrial, environmental, and strategic all at once. Here's how a raid like this typically comes together, because the mechanics matter more than the individual explosions. Ukraine's long-range strike drones, the Liutyis platform most prominent among them, a gasoline piston engine airframe carrying a warhead well over 100 pounds, out to distances measured in the hundreds of miles, don't fly alone on missions like this. They fly as part of a mixed package, some drones climbing to altitude where ground radar can maintain an easier, cleaner track, others staying low, skimming just above the wave tops where the curvature of the Earth itself becomes a shield, tucking the airframe below the radar horizon until it's already dangerously close. Mix those profiles together across a formation, and you're not handing Russian air defense one problem to solve, you're handing them 3 or 4 simultaneously. Different altitudes, different speeds, different radar signatures, all converging on the same stretch of coastline at roughly the same time. That's the fundamental math behind how a modern drone raid overwhelms a modern air defense network, not through brute overwhelming numbers alone, but through forcing constant, expensive decisions about where to point a radar, when to fire an interceptor, and which track actually deserves the attention. There's a second layer to this that's easy to miss if you only look at the finished result, the fires and the smoke, and never think about the routing that got a drone there in the first place. Tuapse sits far enough from any Ukrainian-controlled territory that a strike drone flying toward it has to survive hours in the air before it ever reaches the coastline, which means every mission depends on navigation holding together across a stretch of distance where satellite guidance alone can't be trusted completely. Russian electronic warfare along this entire corridor has spent years getting denser and more sophisticated, specifically in response to exactly this kind of threat. And a drone that loses its GPS lock partway through a multi-hour flight doesn't necessarily fall out of the sky, but it can drift meaningfully off course if its guidance system has nothing else to correct against. That's why platforms built for this kind of range typically lean on inertial navigation as a backbone, holding a heading and a speed even when satellite signals get degraded or spoofed, with terrain and coastline features serving as a final visual correction once the airframe gets close enough to its target for landmarks to actually matter. It doesn't need pinpoint accuracy for the first several hundred miles. It just needs to arrive in the right general area with enough fuel and enough guidance intact to find the coastline, follow it to the right stretch of shore, and let onboard systems handle the final correction from there. And Russian air defense along this stretch of coast is not undefended. That's worth being clear about. On the night of the second major strike, Russia's defense ministry reported intercepting 112 drones overnight across multiple regions, including over the Black Sea and occupied Crimea. On a separate night the following week, that number was 141, downed across 8 Russian regions, plus Crimea and the sea itself. Those aren't small numbers. Layered air defense along this coastline, S-350 batteries, Pantsir systems, shorter-range point defenses guarding the port infrastructure directly, genuinely was catching a meaningful fraction of what Ukraine sent. The problem for Russia wasn't that its defenses failed completely. The problem was that a defense catching the majority of a raid still isn't a defense that stops the raid from working, because you don't need every drone to reach the target for a strike like this to succeed. You need enough of them to reach the right handful of aim points, storage tanks, pipeline junctions, loading equipment, pump stations, the connective tissue of the whole facility, and Ukraine kept finding exactly enough. Walk through what actually happened at Tuapse across those 6 weeks, because the pattern tells its own story. The first strike, on April 16th, hit the refinery directly, starting fires that took 4 days to fully extinguish, and forcing the Rosneft-operated facility to halt operations. Before those fires were even out, a second wave hit again, this time killing at least one person and igniting fresh fires across the export terminal, with local officials confirming a gas pipeline, a church, and 2 schools all sustained damage from debris and the blast radius spreading beyond the industrial perimeter. That strike also produced an oil spill in the Black Sea itself. Independent estimates put its size at around 7 square kilometers, nearly 3 square miles of oil sheen spreading across coastal waters that this region depends on for fishing and tourism alike. And then it happened a third time, and a fourth. Drones finding their way back to a port that authorities kept insisting, publicly, was fully under control. Here's where the story stops being purely about explosions and starts being about something Russian authorities clearly did not want the world watching closely, because the aftermath at Tuapse became its own slow-motion disaster, independent of whatever damage any single strike inflicted. Rospotrebnadzor, Russia's consumer safety watchdog, formally advised residents of Tuapse to limit time outdoors, keep their windows shut, and wear a mask when going outside, citing elevated benzene levels in the air, a chemical formally recognized as a human carcinogen. Local authorities canceled every public event scheduled across a nearly 2-week stretch that normally covers Russia's Labor Day and Victory Day celebrations, among the most heavily promoted civic holidays on the Russian calendar, a decision that tells you plainly how seriously officials on the ground were actually taking the air quality crisis, whatever the messaging coming out of Moscow said publicly. Reports described black rain falling in the surrounding area, soot and contaminated precipitation carried by smoke plumes that observers on the ground compared to a volcanic eruption, thick enough and persistent enough that the comparison wasn't hyperbole so much as the most intuitive way to describe something that genuinely doesn't have an everyday equivalent. And here's where the information war running parallel to the physical one gets genuinely strange. On April 29th, a Krasnodar-based outlet called Anapa Region published an article citing statements attributed to Regional Governor Veniamin Kondratiev, describing the Tuapse situation as fully under control, and characterizing footage of the large-scale fires circulating online as a deliberate psychological operation, accusing Ukraine of attaching fuel tanks to drones purely to manufacture more dramatic-looking footage. That article was deleted within hours of publication, and the outlet itself claimed its website had been hacked specifically to plant that interview. Whatever actually happened there, hacked outlet or an official walking back a quote that went further than intended, the episode captures exactly the credibility problem Russian officials have been fighting throughout this entire campaign. Because the harder version of the story, the one involving benzene warnings and bottled water advisories, was already circulating through the same regional channels at the same time. Russia's own Emergency Situations Minister, Alexander Kurenkov, separately described the burning oil spill as contained and the overall situation as difficult but under control, language that reads very differently once you know residents were simultaneously being told to stay indoors and avoid drinking anything but bottled water. President Putin himself only addressed the situation publicly after the third strike had already happened, and when he did, he leaned on Kurenkov's characterization directly, saying there didn't seem to be any dangers and that people were handling the challenges they faced, a level of understatement that aged particularly poorly against everything unfolding on the ground in Tuapse over the following weeks. Let's talk about why Ukraine has been pouring resources into this specific category of target, because it isn't random and it isn't purely symbolic either. Ukraine has explicitly stepped up its campaign against Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, depots, pipelines over recent months, framing it as retaliation for continued Russian strikes on Ukraine's own power grid. But the strategic logic runs deeper than tit-for-tat retaliation alone. Energy exports are one of the load-bearing pillars of Russia's wartime economy, the revenue stream that helps fund everything from missile production to the salaries of the security apparatus keeping the regime's domestic control intact. A refinery that can't process crude and a terminal that can't load tankers isn't producing revenue, no matter how much oil is still sitting in the ground or in a storage tank somewhere. Every day Tuapse sits offline, whether from direct strike damage or from the safety shutdowns triggered by pipeline pressure drops and contamination concerns, is a day of lost export revenue that doesn't get recovered just because the fires eventually go out. Consider what actually breaks inside a facility like this when a strike lands cleanly, because the damage that matters most isn't always the most visually dramatic part. A tank fire looks spectacular and gets the footage that circulates on Telegram within minutes, but the deeper damage tends to be structural and systemic. A pipeline connection severed here, a pumping station knocked offline there, safety systems automatically dropping pressure across an entire distribution network the instant sensors detect an anomaly anywhere along the line. An oil export terminal isn't one building, it's an interconnected system. Storage capacity, pipeline networks moving crude between tanks and loading berths, pumping infrastructure maintaining the pressure that actually gets oil moving, and piers where tankers physically dock to load. You don't need to destroy every piece of that system to shut the whole thing down. You need to break enough of the connective infrastructure that the pieces which do survive can no longer function together as one working export chain. That's exactly the pattern that played out at Tuapse across those 6 weeks, repeated strikes chipping away at different links in the same chain until the facility couldn't sustain normal operations, even during the stretches between individual attacks. Think about how that compounding damage actually plays out for the people running the facility day to day, because it's not just an engineering problem, it's a decision-making problem under constant, unpredictable pressure. Every time a section of pipeline drops below its safe operating pressure, whether from direct strike damage or purely as a precaution because sensors detected something anomalous elsewhere in the network, engineers have to make a judgment call about whether to isolate that section entirely or attempt a repair while the rest of the terminal keeps limping along at reduced capacity. Do that calculation once, under one attack, and it's manageable. Do it repeatedly, week after week, never knowing whether the next wave of drones is a day away or a month away, and the facility stops operating like a functioning industrial site and starts operating like a site permanently bracing for the next impact, running at partial capacity almost by default because nobody wants to bring a damaged section back to full pressure only to have it torn open again 3 days later. There's also a defender's dilemma worth sitting with here, because it's the same dilemma showing up across nearly every Ukrainian long-range strike campaign this year. Point defense systems protecting a fixed, high-value site like an oil terminal face an impossible trade-off once a strike gets close enough. Anti-aircraft guns and short-range interceptors positioned to protect storage tanks and pipelines have to actually fire on incoming drones passing directly over or near that same infrastructure, which means every engagement carries the risk of the defense itself contributing to the damage, stray rounds, fragments, or a drone that gets hit but still carries enough momentum to crash into exactly the facility the gun was trying to protect. Crews defending a target like this aren't just fighting the incoming threat, they're fighting the physical reality that the safest place to shoot from isn't always available when the thing you're protecting is close enough to be endangered by your own defensive fire. That dilemma only gets worse the more times the facility gets hit, because every previous strike leaves behind wreckage, debris fields, and damaged structures that themselves start interfering with radar coverage and gun sight lines on the next attempt. A pristine industrial site gives point defense crews clean lines of sight and predictable terrain to work with. A site that's already absorbed 3 or 4 strikes over the preceding weeks is covered in twisted metal, partially collapsed structures, and clutter that makes distinguishing an inbound drone from background debris genuinely harder with every passing raid. In effect, the damage from each previous wave makes the facility incrementally easier to hit again, because the defenders are increasingly working against a backdrop their own sensors were never calibrated to read cleanly. That's part of why a sustained campaign like this one produces returns that compound rather than plateau. Each strike doesn't just add its own direct damage, it degrades the baseline the defenders are working from for every strike that follows. Now think about the broader pattern this campaign fits into, because Tuapse wasn't an isolated case this year. Ukrainian drones have repeatedly struck Russia's Baltic seaport of Ust-Luga as well, hitting an oil loading terminal there multiple times within the same general stretch of this year's campaign, a facility on the opposite side of the country entirely from Tuapse. That geographic spread matters. It tells you this isn't a single successful raid against one vulnerable target. It's a sustained, multi-front campaign against Russia's oil export infrastructure broadly, forcing Moscow to spread air defense resources and repair capacity across facilities on entirely separate coastlines simultaneously, each one requiring its own dedicated defensive posture, its own repair crews, its own contingency planning for the next wave that might already be inbound. Zoom out even further, and the strategic picture gets more uncomfortable for Moscow still. Russia's oil export infrastructure was never designed with this kind of sustained internal threat in mind. Every major terminal, Tuapse on the Black Sea, Ust-Luga on the Baltic, and others scattered across the country's coastlines, was built around the assumption that the real risks were mechanical failure, weather, ordinary industrial accidents, not a sustained campaign of precision strikes launched from inside a war Russia itself started. Retrofitting that entire network for genuine resilience against repeated drone attacks, thicker containment, redundant piping, dispersed storage that doesn't put all of a facility's capacity in range of a single strike, isn't something that happens over a few weeks. It's a multi-year infrastructure project, competing for the same steel, the same skilled labor, and the same construction capacity that Russia's broader war effort is already straining to keep supplied elsewhere. Every week this campaign continues without that hardening catching up is another week where the economics keep favoring whoever's sending the drones rather than whoever's trying to protect the pipeline. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you were responsible for defending a facility like Tuapse, knowing this campaign had already proven it could return again and again over a 6-week stretch, would you prioritize hardening the physical infrastructure itself, thicker containment walls, redundant pipeline routing, dispersed storage, or would you pour those same resources into denser air defense coverage instead, betting you can stop the next wave before it ever reaches the fence line? There's a real argument for both, and the honest answer is that neither one alone would have been enough against a campaign built specifically around sustained repetition rather than a single knockout strike. Drop your own read on that trade-off in the comments, because I think reasonable people land in genuinely different places on it. Let's talk about what 6 weeks of this actually costs, beyond the immediate fires and the casualties on the ground, because the compounding effect is where the real strategic damage lives. Every time the refinery goes offline, even temporarily, that's lost processing capacity that doesn't get made up later, crude that either has to be rerouted to other facilities already running near their own capacity limits, or simply left unprocessed. Every safety shutdown triggered by pressure anomalies or contamination concerns adds downtime that has nothing directly to do with strike damage, but everything to do with the cumulative stress the facility has been placed under. And every dollar spent on emergency response, on firefighting resources, on environmental remediation for an oil spill spreading across several square kilometers of coastal water, on public health measures for a population being told to stay indoors because of carcinogenic air quality, is a dollar that isn't going toward whatever this war actually needed it for on the front lines that same week. And here's the part that should genuinely worry Russian planners looking at facilities like this one going forward. A campaign that can return to the same target repeatedly over 6 weeks, using a mix of altitude profiles and flight paths specifically engineered to keep exploiting the same fundamental